You think you know what quiet is, but you don't. In the woods, there's always the wind or the crickets. In a soundproof room, you hear the blood in your ears. Down here, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the quiet has weight. It presses against your temples and waits for you to make a mistake. I'm a Class 3 saturation diver. That means for 30 days at a time, I live in a pressurized steel tube sitting on the ocean floor. My home and my prison is Habitat Unit 4. The crew calls it the drop. I keep signing up for another tour anyway, because 7 miles of water between you and the rest of humanity solves a lot of problems. It's basically a minivan-sized metal canister buried under 7 miles of water. The physics of it are simple, even if they sound like a nightmare. The pressure outside is about 8 tons per square inch. If I were to step outside without my pressurized suit, or if the hull were to crack even a fraction of an inch, I wouldn't just drown. I would be turned into meat jelly in less than a microsecond. The ocean would force my entire body through that crack faster than the speed of sound. That's what keeps you awake the first few nights. The knowledge that the only thing separating you from instant liquefaction is 4 inches of titanium and a seal that was welded by the lowest bidder. But you get used to it. You have to. If you think about the water weight, you crack. And down here, you can't just quit. We are saturated with helium and oxygen. If I wanted to go home right now, I'd have to sit in a decompression chamber for a week. If I tried to swim to the surface, my blood would boil in my veins before I made it 50 feet. So, I'm here, stuck in the dark with Miller. Miller was a good kid, but he wasn't built for the drop. He was 28, fit, and technically competent, but he had too much imagination. You don't want imagination at this depth. You want a checklist. You want routine. I learned that the hard way my first tour, back when I still saw shapes in the sonar snow and heard voices in the pump noise. You either kill that part of your brain or it kills you. Our job was straightforward. A trans-Pacific fiber-optic cable had snagged on a ridge and snapped. It was costing some telecom giant millions by the hour. Our job was to go out in the suits, find the break, splice it, and bury it. Routine maintenance. Industrial plumbing with a telecom budget and a body count if you screw it up. The first 3 days were standard. We established the cycle. Wake up, choke down the nutrient paste that tasted like wet cardboard, drink the recycled water that always tasted a little bit like ozone, and suit up. Everyone thinks the worst part of saturation diving is the dark or the cold. They're wrong. It's your own voice. We breathe a helium-oxygen mix. Nitrogen will wreck you at this depth. Side effect is we sound like cartoon chipmunks. It's hard to be terrified when your partner sounds like he's been huffing party balloons, but after a few shifts, your brain edits the squeak out and you just hear the words. You start reading lips and body language instead. You stop laughing. By day 4, the routine had set in. We were tired. The cold down here creates a deep ache in your joints that never really goes away. We had just finished a 6-hour EVA outside, wrestling with the cable in the absolute pitch black of the trench, illuminated only by the narrow cones of our headlamps. We cycled back into the habitat, pressurized the airlock, and stripped out of the hot water suits. The smell of the habitat hit us, that unique mix of unwashed bodies, machine grease, and recycled air. I remember I was sitting on my bunk, rubbing a cramp out of my calf. Miller was across from me, staring at the wall. He had taped a laminated photo of his daughter, Sophie, right next to his head. Gap-toothed grin, chocolate ice cream smeared across her cheeks, one pigtail already escaping the elastic. He spent half his downtime just staring at that picture, whispering to it. Once, I woke up to him laughing under his breath and telling her not to run by the pool. I never asked what memory he was stuck in. Privacy is the only luxury we have down there. I told Miller to get some sleep. I said we had a heavy rotation coming up, and he looked like hell. He didn't look at me. He just kept staring at the hull wall, right next to the photo. He asked me if I heard it. I stopped rubbing my leg. The habitat is full of noises. The scrubbers hiss, the cooling pumps thrum, the metal groans as the thermal layers shift. If any of those sounds stopped, that's when you worried. I listened. I told him I didn't hear anything but the pumps. He shook his head. He said it wasn't the pumps. He said it was coming from outside. I told him that was impossible. We were sitting on a shelf in the Hadal zone. There is no outside. There are blind fish, giant amphipods, and mud. Nothing that makes noise. I told him it was just the hull settling, thermal expansion, metal contracting in the cold. Miller finally looked at me. His eyes were rimmed with red, huge dark circles under them. He looked like he hadn't slept since we dropped. He told me that metal doesn't have a rhythm. I was tired. I was irritable. I wanted to turn off the lights and black out for 8 hours. I told him to put his earplugs in and quit spooking himself. I reached up and killed the main cabin light, plunging us into the dim red glow of the emergency sleep lights. I climbed into my bunk and pulled the blanket up. I closed my eyes, listening to the familiar hum of the life support systems, the rhythmic chug hiss that meant we were alive. I was just drifting off when I heard it. It was faint, a dull, metallic tap against the outer hull. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I waited. Maybe it was just a loose piece of equipment on the external rack. Maybe a rock shifting? It came again, louder this time. Distinct. I opened my eyes. In the red gloom, I saw Miller sitting up in his bunk. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the small reinforced quartz porthole at the far end of the habitat, the only window we had. I whispered his name. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't answer. He just pointed at the wall. 3 taps, evenly spaced, deliberate. I sat up. The air in the habitat suddenly felt very thin. I told myself it was the cable. Maybe the current was swinging the loose end of the fiber-optic line against the habitat leg. That made sense. It had to be the cable. I swung my legs out of the bunk and walked over to the control panel to check the external sensors. I told Miller I was going to check the visuals, just to prove to him it was debris. I sounded confident, but I made sure to keep my voice low. I flicked the monitor on. The screen flickered to life, showing the feed from the external cameras. Grainy, black and white darkness. Floating particulate matter looked like snow in a blizzard. I cycled through camera 1, camera 2, camera 3. Nothing. Just the empty, crushing dark of the ocean floor and the illuminated patch of silt where our tools were sitting. I turned back to Miller. I told him there was nothing there. I told him it was just the cable swinging in the current. Miller didn't move. He was still staring at the wall, his head cocked to the side like he was listening to a secret. He whispered that the cable was on the port side. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. He was right. The cable work site was to our left. The sound came again. It was coming from the starboard side. Miller looked at me then. In the red light, his face looked pale and waxy. He didn't look scared, exactly. He looked resigned. He told me that, whatever it wasn't hitting the metal anymore. He said it was tapping on the glass. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked at the glass. That was almost worse. If it had kept going, I could have triangulated it. I could have told myself it was a loose bracket swinging in the current or a piston misfiring in the ballast system, but it stopped the second I turned my head. That implied intent. That implied that whatever was out there knew I was listening. For a long time, neither of us moved. The red emergency lights bathed the habitat in the color of a dark room. The only sound was Miller's breathing, fast, shallow, wet. He was hyperventilating. I unbuckled my restraints and floated off the bunk. The gravity down here is normal, but every movement feels heavy, like the air is thicker than it should be. I moved to the viewport. It's a circular piece of fused quartz, 6 inches thick, reinforced with a titanium collar. It's the strongest part of the ship. It's also the coldest. I put my face near the glass. You don't press your skin against it. It's cold enough to burn, but I got close enough to feel the chill radiating off it. I couldn't see a damn thing. Just the reflection of the red emergency lights and my own tired, pale face staring back at me. Beyond that, absolute void. The kind of black that swallows light and doesn't give it back. I turned to Miller. I kept my voice steady, the way you speak to a spooked horse. He clung to my calm like it was oxygen. If I cracked, we both did. I told him there was nothing there. I told him it was probably a rock tumbling down the trench wall that hit the glass. A 1 in a million shot. Miller didn't buy it. He was sitting with his knees pulled to his chest, rocking slightly. He mumbled that rocks don't tap in patterns. I didn't have an answer for that. I went to the console and brought the main systems back up. The hum of the reactor increased, and the monitors flickered from standby to active. I needed to see outside, but I wasn't about to turn on the external floodlights. If there was something out there, I didn't want to announce our position like a lighthouse. Instead, I woke up the guppy, the little inspection drone parked on the rail outside. I grabbed the joystick. My hands were sweating, making the plastic slick. The guppy's about the size of a basketball with a camera and a toy claw on it. Just enough to poke at trouble, not solve it. I told Miller to watch the screen. We'd do a slow hull sweep instead of lighting ourselves up. The screen hissed with static, then cleared. The view from the guppy was disorienting at first. I undocked it, and the camera spun, showing the side of our habitat, a wall of riveted metal covered in a thin layer of gray silt. I pulsed the thrusters. The drone whined, a sound I could hear faintly through the hull, and drifted away from the station. The ocean floor is usually dead still. The water down here doesn't move much, but on the monitor, the marine snow, the constant drift of organic debris falling from the surface, was swirling. Something had disturbed the water recently. I steered the drone in a wide arc around the habitat. I checked the oxygen intake valves. Intact. I checked the comms cable. Intact. I checked the viewport where I had just been standing. Nothing. Just scratches on the metal and the endless dark. I started to relax. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving me feeling hollow and exhausted. I told Miller to look. I told him the perimeter was clear. Miller finally looked at the screen. He squinted. He asked me what that light was. I looked back at the monitor. At the very edge of the camera's range, about 50 yards out, there was a faint green pulse. Bioluminescence is common in the deep. Anglerfish, jellyfish, squid, they all make their own light. But this was different. It wasn't a steady glow, and it wasn't a flash. It was a rhythmic pulse. On, off, on, off. I pushed the joystick forward. The drone hummed, pushing into the darkness. The light moved. It drifted backward, keeping the exact same distance from the drone. It was retreating. I frowned. Curiosity overtook the fear for a second. I increased the thruster power. The drone surged forward. The light danced away, playful, leading us away from the habitat. Then, a second light appeared to the left. Then a third, above the first. They were drifting in formation. Miller stood up. He walked over to the console and gripped the back of my chair. His fingers dug into the vinyl. He whispered that I should turn it around. He said we shouldn't be following them. I ignored him. I needed to know. I zoomed the camera lens in. The lights weren't floating freely. They were attached to something. The camera autofocus hunted for a second, buzzing as it tried to lock onto the shapes in the gloom. Then the image sharpened. It wasn't a fish. It was a hand. A long, pale hand with too many joints in the fingers. The skin was translucent, like parchment paper soaked in water. You could see the blue veins pulsing underneath. And on the tip of the index finger, where the nail should be, there was a nodule of glowing green flesh. It was using the light as a lure. I I slammed the thrusters in reverse. I didn't want to see what the hand was attached to. I wanted the drone back at the station, now. But the camera feed didn't move. The drone was caught. On the screen, the hand flexed. It wasn't holding the drone. The drone was snagged on something, or held by something else. Then, the camera jerked upward. The view spun wildly, blurring into streaks of gray and black before stabilizing on a face. I heard Miller make a sound, a high, sharp whimper that got cut off in his throat. The face filled the monitor. It was pressed right up against the lens. It had no nose, just two vertical slits in the center of a flat, pale landscape of skin. The mouth was a jagged line, sealed shut. But the eyes were huge, reflective, like a cat's eyes caught in headlights. They didn't have pupils, just a milky, iridescent sheen. But they weren't fish eyes. They were set forward. Binocular vision, predator vision. And they were looking right at me, not at the drone, through the camera. It felt like it was looking down the fiber-optic tether, through the monitors, and straight into the habitat. The creature didn't roar. It didn't strike. It just tilted its head. A slow, jerky motion, like a bird studying a worm. Then, it smiled. The jaw unhinged, dropping impossibly low, revealing rows of translucent, needle-thin teeth that angled backward into a black gullet. Static erupted across the screen. A screech of tearing metal came through the habitat's external audio sensors, a sound loud enough to make my teeth ache. The monitor went black. No signal flashed in red letters. I sat there, gripping the dead joystick. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Miller wasn't whimpering anymore. He was laughing, a quiet, breathless, hysterical sound. He backed away from the console, retreating to his bunk. He kept muttering the same thing over and over. He said he knew who that was. He said it looked like the crew from the last rotation. He said they looked hungry. I turned off the monitor. I didn't want to see the no signal message anymore. I wanted to tell him he was crazy. I wanted to tell him it was a giant squid or an unknown species of eel, but I couldn't. Because squid don't have thumbs, and eels don't smile. I went to the equipment locker and took out the flare gun and the heavy wrench. I didn't know what good they would do against 8 tons of water pressure, but I needed to hold something heavy. Then the tapping started again. Not on the hull this time, and not on the viewport. It was coming from the airlock door. The airlock on Habitat Unit 4 is simple. Inner door by my bunk, outer door to the ocean, and a steel box in between we use as a shower and staging room. The tapping was coming from the outer door. Whatever was out there had already crawled into the protective cage and was sitting in the wet porch, knocking on the steel like a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. I stood there with the heavy wrench in my hand, feeling ridiculous. You can't swing a wrench at a submarine door. The blast shielding is thick enough to stop a torpedo, but the monkey part of my brain wanted a weapon. I watched the wheel on the inner door. It's a manual override, a big red iron circle. If that wheel started to turn, it meant the locking mechanism on the outside was being manipulated. It didn't move. The tapping stopped after a minute, replaced by a slow, scraping sound. Metal on metal, like a key gouging paint. I threw the wrench on my bunk and went to the comm station. We needed to call topside. I needed to tell the support ship, the Ares, that we had hostile wildlife and a destroyed ROV. I needed them to winch us up. To hell with the decompression schedule. I'd take the joint pain over this. I sat down at the desk and flipped the switch for the hydrophone array. Usually the background noise of the ocean fills the speakers, a mix of static, whale song, and the churn of the support ship's thrusters 7 miles up. This time there was nothing. Absolute digital silence. I checked the gain. I checked the power. Everything was green. I keyed the mic. I called for the Ares, identifying myself as Diver 1. I waited. No side tone, no crackle of acknowledgement. I tried again. I shouted this time. I told them we had a situation. Miller walked up behind me. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just stood there, breathing that shallow, rattling breath. I ignored him. I checked the hardline diagnostics. The habitat is connected to the surface ship by an umbilical, a massive armored bundle of cables that gives us power, oxygen, and data. It's our lifeline. Without it, we're just a battery-powered coffin. The power readings were steady. The oxygen flow was normal, but the fiber-optic data line was reading open circuit. That wasn't a malfunction. A malfunction gives you an error code. An open circuit means the wire isn't there anymore. I felt the blood drain out of my face. I spun the chair around and told Miller the bad news. I told him the data line was severed. We had power and air for now, but we couldn't talk to the ship. We were alone. Miller didn't look upset. He looked relieved. He smiled, a twitchy, nervous expression that didn't reach his eyes. He pointed to the backup radio receiver, a dusty piece of kit we rarely used because VLF radio quality is garbage at this depth. He told me I was wrong. He said the comms were fine. He said he'd been listening to them for 10 minutes. I looked at the receiver. The power light was off. The headset was hanging on the hook. I told him the radio was off. I told him to snap out of it. He shook his head, looking at me like I was the one who was crazy. He reached over, grabbed the headset, and put it on. He pressed the cans against his ears, closing his eyes. He whispered that she was singing. I asked him who. I thought he meant the surface tech, maybe Sarah from logistics. He said, Sophie. Sophie is his daughter. She's 6 years old. She's in Ohio. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I stood up and ripped the headset off his head. I told him to stop it. I told him nobody was singing. He tried to grab it back, scratching at my arm. He was desperate, like an addict losing a fix. He yelled at me to give her back. I shoved him. He stumbled back against the lockers, sliding down to the floor. He didn't fight me. He just curled up, covering his ears with his hands, rocking back and forth. I looked at the headset in my hand. It was unplugged. The jack was dangling loose in the air. Every time I tell this part, people ask why I didn't just throw the damn thing away. But curiosity is a disease, and down here, it's terminal. I slowly lifted the headset to my ears. I knew it was dead. I knew it was impossible, but Miller's reaction had been so visceral. I pressed the left cup to my ear. At first, silence, just the plastic shell against my skin. Then, faint, so faint I almost missed it. It wasn't coming from the wire. It was resonating through the hull, vibrating the magnetic diaphragm in the speakers directly. Static, but not random static. It had a cadence, high, rhythmic chirps buried in the white noise, and then a voice. It wasn't a little girl. It wasn't Sophie. It was a digital slurry of sounds rearranged to sound like a human. Daddy, see me. The voice was wet. It sounded like it was bubbling up through a throat full of water. I threw the headset across the room. It hit the bulkhead with a crack that made us both jump. Miller looked up at me from the floor. He wasn't crying anymore. He looked vindicated. He asked me if I heard her. I didn't answer him. I walked over to the life support controls. I needed to see if the oxygen mix was off. Maybe we were both hallucinating. Maybe the CO2 scrubbers were full and we were just suffocating slowly, dreaming of monsters. The sensors read normal. Oxygen 21%, helium 78%, CO2 negligible. We weren't high. We weren't suffocating. I looked at the open circuit warning on the data line again. I realized then that the creature I'd seen on the drone camera, the one with the hand, hadn't just attacked the drone blindly. It had severed the data cable specifically. It knew that cutting the power would trigger emergency alarms and ballast blows. It knew that cutting the air would kill us too fast. But cutting the comms? That kept us alive, but isolated. It wanted us to be here. I looked at Miller. He had crawled over to the headset and was plugging it back in. He was weeping softly, whispering promises to the static. I let him do it. I didn't have the energy to fight him. I went to my bunk and grabbed the manual for the external systems. I needed to know if there was a way to trigger the emergency ascent buoy manually without a signal from the surface. As I flipped the pages, the habitat lurched. A heavy metallic thud shook the floor plates. Dust fell from the overhead pipes. We both froze. That wasn't a tap. That wasn't a scratch. That was the sound of something heavy landing on the roof. Miller looked up at the ceiling, eyes wide. He pulled the headset off. He told me they were done talking and that they were coming in. You realize how small the world is when it's being walked on. The habitat is a cylinder, roughly 20 feet long. When something lands on the roof, you feel it in your teeth. The vibration travels down the support struts and into the floor. Miller and I stood there, paralyzed, tracking the sound. It was heavy, purposeful. Thump, drag, thump. It wasn't floating. It was walking along the top of the hull, gripping the external railing. It moved from the center of the roof toward the stern, toward the airlock. I stopped breathing. My eyes locked on the inner airlock door. The engineers swear the airlock is fail-safe. No software, no hydraulics, just metal. A heavy iron wheel on the inside, a matching one outside, linked by a solid shaft through the pressure hull. Turn the outside wheel and gears bite, dogs retract, the seal breaks. It takes about 50 pounds of torque to move it. You don't spin it by accident. The sound of footsteps stopped right above the porch. Then, silence. A long, stretching silence where the only sound was the hum of the recycler and the frantic beat of my own heart. Then, the wheel moved. It started with a groan, a high-pitched shriek of metal grinding against metal. The red paint on the inner wheel flaked off as the shaft twisted. It turned an inch to the left, then stopped, then an inch more. I stepped back, my boots scraping on the grating. I couldn't process what I was seeing. A fish doesn't know what a door handle is. A squid doesn't understand mechanics. But this thing did. It was testing the resistance. It was figuring out the leverage. The wheel groaned again, louder this time. It turned a full quarter rotation. The locking dogs inside the door frame clanked, shifting in their housing. Miller let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. I looked at him. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the wheel with a look of pure, beatific adoration. His face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. He whispered that she was struggling. He said she was cold, and her hands were too small to turn it alone. I told him to stay back. I reached for the wrench I'd dropped on the bunk, but Miller was faster. He lunged. He didn't attack me. He went straight for the door. He grabbed the red wheel with both hands and started to pull. He was trying to help it open the door. Panic is a funny thing. It overrides logic. Logic says, don't fight your partner. Panic says, if that door opens, you are red mist. I hit him. I didn't think about it. I just tackled him from the side. We hit the metal grating hard. Miller was smaller than me, but he was running on pure adrenaline and psychosis. He kicked and clawed, screaming that I was keeping her out. He yelled that I was a monster. He got an elbow into my ribs that knocked the wind out of me, but I managed to get a forearm across his throat. I pinned him against the lockers. I screamed at him that if he opened that door, we would implode. I told him he would kill us both. He didn't care. He stared up at me with eyes that were completely gone, pupils blown wide, white showing all around. He choked out that it didn't matter. He said she was lonely. He tried to bite me. He snapped his teeth inches from my face. I had to hurt him. I didn't want to, but I had to. I drove my knee into his solar plexus hard. All the air left his lungs in a wheezing whoosh. He went limp for a second, gasping like a landed fish. I scrambled off him and grabbed the zip ties from the emergency kit on the wall. We keep them for bundling cables, big, thick plastic straps. I flipped him onto his stomach. He started to struggle again, weakly, kicking at the floor. I yanked his arms behind his back and cinched the plastic tight around his wrists. I did his ankles next, binding them together. I dragged him to his bunk. He was dead weight, sobbing quietly now. I used another 2 ties to strap his arm binds to the metal frame of the bed. He was secured. He couldn't reach the door. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. My ribs throbbed where he'd hit me. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't make a fist. The screeching sound started again. I snapped my head toward the door. The wheel was still turning. The creature outside hadn't stopped. It was grinding slowly, agonizingly counterclockwise. Another locking dog disengaged. There were 6 dogs total. 2 were unlocked. I scrambled up. I grabbed the wrench. I ran to the door. I jammed the handle of the wrench through the spokes of the wheel, wedging it against the heavy steel frame of the door. The wheel jerked. The metal groaned under the stress. The wrench bent slightly, the steel protesting, but it held. The turning stopped. The creature outside pushed again. I saw the wheel tremble, the torque fighting against the wrench. The entire door shuddered. Then, nothing. The pressure released. The wheel settled back slightly. Silence returned to the habitat. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the wrench. It was wedged tight, holding the line between us and the ocean. Miller was whispering again from his bunk. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was chanting. A low, rhythmic murmur that matched the cadence of the static we'd heard on the radio. I walked over to him. I checked his bonds. They were tight. I asked him what he was saying. He looked up at me. His nose was bleeding from where we'd hit the floor. He smiled, his teeth stained red. He told me they were smart. He said they realized the door was stuck. I looked at the jammed wheel. I told him they couldn't get in. The wrench would hold. Miller shook his head slowly. He told me I didn't understand. He said they weren't trying the door anymore. He said they were going for the air. We call it the drop. But after Miller cracked, it felt more like a cage at the zoo. And we were the exhibit. I spent the next 3 hours sitting on the floor with my back against the control console, watching the jammed wrench in the airlock wheel. My hand was cramping from gripping a heavy flare gun that I knew, logically, wouldn't do a damn thing. If I fired it inside, I'd burn us alive. If I fired it at the window, we'd implode. But it was heavy, and it felt like a gun, so I held it. Miller had passed out. The adrenaline dump, combined with the shock and the zip ties, had finally shut his brain down. He was slumped on his bunk, his breathing ragged but steady. Every now and then he'd twitch, testing the plastic straps against the metal frame, but he didn't wake up. I was grateful for the silence. Down here, though, silence just means you're waiting for the next thing to go wrong. It started with the scratching. It wasn't the heavy industrial grinding of the airlock wheel this time. It was lighter, tentative. It sounded like someone was running a fingernail along the seams of the titanium plates. It moved. It started at the roof, then slid down the starboard side, then under the floor plates. Then another sound joined it. A soft, metallic ping, like someone flicking a fingernail against a wine glass. They were testing the hull. I realized then that Miller was right. They weren't just brute forcing the door. They were inspecting us. They were looking for welds that had rusted, valves that were loose, seals that had dried out. They were auditing our life support system with the precision of a demolition crew. I couldn't take the guessing anymore. I needed to know how many there were. I stood up, my knees popping in the cold dampness of the room. I walked to the viewport. I kept the internal lights off, so the habitat was still bathed in that suffocating red emergency glow. I reached out and hit the switch for the external floodlights. Usually, when you turn on the floods, the light simply vanishes. The ocean is too big, too dark. The beams cut a cone of white for about 30 feet and then die. This time, the light hit something immediately. They were swarming. I recoiled, stumbling back against the console. My breath hitched in a painful gasp. There were at least 5 of them visible just in the cone of the viewport. They were drifting in the water, suspended effortlessly, like pale ribbons of smoke. They were humanoid, but only in the way a nightmare resembles reality. They were long, 7, maybe 8 feet if they stretched out. Their skin was the color of a dead fish's belly, pale and translucent, slick with some kind of mucus that diffracted the floodlight. They didn't have legs, not really. Their lower bodies trailed off into fused, muscular tails that moved with hypnotic grace. But their upper bodies, that was the horror. They had ribs. They had shoulders. They had arms that ended in hands with too many fingers. One of them noticed the light. It turned. It drifted toward the window. It didn't swim. It just slid through the water, closing the distance until it was hovering inches from the quartz. I forced myself to look at it. I forced my brain to catalog it, because if I analyzed it, maybe I wouldn't scream. It had no nose, just 2 vertical slits that fluttered open and closed, tasting the water. Its mouth was a wide, lipless gash filled with needle teeth that interlocked perfectly. But the eyes were the worst part. They were huge, milky orbs, devoid of pupils, reflecting the red light of the cabin like dull mirrors. It raised a hand. I saw the webbing between the long, spindly fingers. I saw the bioluminescent node on the tip of the index finger, currently dark. It placed its palm against the glass. I heard the sound through the hull, a wet, flat slap. It pressed. I saw the pale flesh flatten against the quartz. It was testing the strength. It looked at me, directly at me, and tilted its head. It looked curious, not angry, just hungry and patient. Then it opened its mouth. I expected a roar. I expected a hiss. What came through the hull wasn't a sound made by vocal cords. It was a vibration, a frequency that rattled the fillings in my teeth. It was mimicking the sound of the wrench hitting the door. It was mocking me. I backed away. I retreated to the center of the room, putting the command chair between me and the window. The creature didn't leave. It stayed there, plastered against the glass, watching me. Then, the speakers crackled. I jumped, spinning around to face the comms console. The open circuit light was still flashing. The line to the surface was still dead, but the speakers were live. Static hissed, rising and falling in waves. And then, a voice cut through. "Jack!" It was Miller's voice. I froze. I looked at the bunk. Miller was fast asleep, his mouth open, drool running down his chin. He hadn't moved. The voice came again, louder this time, clearer. "Jack, it hurts. The straps hurt." It was perfect. It had Miller's Ohio drawl. It had his specific pitch. But there was something wrong with the cadence. It was too smooth. It lacked the jagged edges of human emotion. It sounded like a recording of Miller being played on a high-quality tape deck. I looked at the window. The creature was still there. Its mouth was moving, twitching in sync with the words coming out of the speakers. It was using the hull as a transducer. It was vibrating the metal at the exact frequency to drive the internal speakers. "Jack," the Miller voice said, "open the door. Sophie is cold. We're all cold." I covered my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut. I told myself it wasn't real. I told myself it was just physics, sound waves, manipulation. But then the voice changed. It dropped an octave. It lost the Miller drawl and became something flat, metallic, and buzzing. "Oxygen," it whispered. 20%. My eyes snapped open. I looked at the life support display. The oxygen levels were dropping. The creature at the window smiled, its needle teeth glistening in the floodlight. It pushed off the glass and drifted upward, toward the roof, toward the intake valves. They weren't just watching anymore. They were done playing with the door. They were going to choke us out. The alarm didn't sound like a siren. Down here at this pressure, sound behaves differently. It felt like a physical blow to the chest, a rhythmic thumping that vibrated the floorboards. The atmospheric critical warning. I scrambled to the console, tripping over my own feet. My head felt light, fuzzy, like I'd had 3 beers on an empty stomach. That was the first sign. The movies lie about hypoxia. You don't clutch your throat and flop around. You just get stupid, then weirdly calm, and then you don't wake up. I slapped the silence button, killing the thumping noise. The silence that rushed back into the habitat was worse. You could hear the metal cooling, ticking in the walls, like it was settling in for a burial. I looked at the readouts. The numbers were scrolling in red text. Oxygen, 16%. CO2, 3%. Scrubber, flow, 0. We weren't just running out of air. We were being poisoned. The scrubbers had stopped moving air. Diagnostics were clean on the motors and power. One line kept flashing. External intake blocked. The intake on the roof drags cold seawater past the reaction plates so they don't cook themselves. If that intake plugs, the unit protects itself the only way it can. It shuts down and lets us choke instead of catching fire. I switched to the roof camera, camera 4. The screen was dark at first, just the murk of the ocean. I tweaked the contrast. There was something jammed into the intake impeller. It wasn't seaweed. It was white, jagged, and hard. It looked like a bone, a femur maybe, or a rib from a whale. It had been shoved into the fan blades with precise, malicious intent. They hadn't just broken it, they had disabled it. I looked back at the oxygen levels. 15%. At this depth, with this mix, we had maybe an hour before the CO2 levels caused permanent brain damage. Maybe 2 hours before we simply went to sleep and never woke up. I turned to Miller. He was awake. He was straining against the zip ties, his head lolling back on the pillow. He was smiling that same vacant, terrifying smile. I told him the scrubbers were down. I told him we were going to die if I didn't fix it. He didn't seem to care. He mumbled something about the air being thick. He said it tasted like metal. He asked me if I could taste the copper. I ignored him. There was no point in arguing with a broken mind. I knew what I had to do, and the thought of it made my bowels turn to water. I had to go outside. I had to do an EVA. I had to cycle the airlock, swim up to the roof, clear the jam, and reset the system. In normal conditions, this is a routine 20-minute job. But in normal conditions, you don't have a pack of predatory mimics waiting for you in the dark. I staggered to the equipment locker, my movement sluggish. The CO2 was already fogging my head. I nearly dropped the helmet and caught it against my chest before it could smack the deck. My tongue felt too big for my mouth. I forced myself into the hot water suit. The rubber clung to my skin, hoses and tubes tugging at me as I sealed the zipper. The warm water would come later. Right now, it just felt like climbing into a body bag. I clipped the small emergency bottle onto the harness. 10 minutes of gas if the main hose got cut. 10 quiet minutes in the dark while my own breathing ran out. I grabbed the welding torch. Underwater, it doesn't throw a flame, just a white-hot arc that will cut steel or boil anything soft that gets too close. That was the whole arsenal. One oversized condom full of hot water, a hose the monsters could slice, and a cutter that might as well have last resort stamped on it. I walked over to Miller. I checked his bonds one last time. I told him to stay put. I told him I'd be right back. He looked at me with those wide, red-rimmed eyes. He stopped, smiling. For a second, just a second, the madness seemed to clear, replaced by a look of profound pity. He whispered that I shouldn't go. He said they were waiting. He said they wanted me to come out so they could see what I looked like on the inside. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I told him to shut up. I grabbed the heavy iron wheel of the inner airlock door, the one we had fought over, and spun it. The door swung open. I stepped into the wet porch. The steel grating clanked under my weighted boots. I smelled the salt and the rot of the ocean, the smell that lingers in the lock. I spun the wheel shut behind me. I was now sealed in the transition chamber. I connected my helmet to the internal umbilical. I checked the flow. Gas hissed into my mask, cold and metallic. It cleared my head a little. The oxygen mix in the suit was higher than in the habitat. I faced the outer door, the one Miller had tried to open. I reached for the floodlight controls on the wall and killed them. If I was going out there, I wasn't going to light myself up like a target. I would go in the dark. I would use the red tactical light on my helmet, the one that doesn't carry as far. I put my hand on the valve to flood the chamber. This is the part that always gets you, the anticipation. You turn the valve and the water rushes in from the floor vents. It rises up your legs, your chest, your neck. It squeezes the suit against your skin. You feel the pressure building, the 8 tons per square inch equalizing with the pressure in your body. I turned the valve. Water roared in. It was freezing, even through the suit. It swirled around my knees, black and heavy. I watched the water level rise past the viewport on the outer door. I watched the water cover my faceplate. The room was full. The pressure equalized. The outer door locked light turned green. I gripped the welding torch in my right hand. I reached out with my left and grabbed the handle of the outer hatch. I hesitated. I could hear them through the water now. Not tapping, not scratching, clicking. It was a rapid, chatter-like sound. Like dolphins, but deeper, more guttural. They were communicating. They knew the door was opening. I thought about staying in the lock. I thought about just sitting there until the air ran out. It would be peaceful, but then I thought about Miller inside, suffocating in his own waste, tied to a bed. I thought about my alimony checks. I thought about the sheer, stubborn refusal to let these things win. I pushed the handle. The outer door swung outward into the abyss. I stepped out onto the porch. The ocean was absolute. It was a physical weight, a darkness so complete it felt solid. My helmet light cut a pathetic red beam into the gloom, illuminating only the drifting snow and the steel railing of the habitat. I looked up toward the roof. The intake valve was 20 feet above me, and between me and the valve, floating silently in the red beam of my light, were 3 of them. They were waiting. There is no such thing as running on the bottom of the ocean. In a saturation suit, you are a Michelin man made of rubber and hot water tubes. You weigh 300 pounds. Every step is a battle against physics. You lean forward, plant your boot, and wait for the mud to take your weight. Then you drag the next leg forward. I stepped out onto the porch, the darkness swallowing me whole. My helmet light was a pathetic red smear against the void. The 3 creatures hanging above the railing didn't attack. They didn't scream. They just dispersed. They separated like oil on water, drifting backward into the gloom. It was smoother than any swim stroke I'd ever seen. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, dissolved into the blackness beyond the rail. That was worse. If they were attacking, I could fight. If they were hiding, I had to watch my back. I gripped the welding torch until my knuckles popped inside the glove. I checked my umbilical, the thick yellow hose connecting me to the habitat. It was my leash. If they cut that, I was dead. I moved toward the ladder on the side of the hull. My magnetic boots locked onto the rungs. I started to climb. Climbing is the most vulnerable position you can be in. Your face is pressed against the metal. Your back is exposed to the entire ocean. Every instinct in my primate brain was screaming that there was something behind me. I could feel the water displacement, pressure waves hitting the back of my suit. Something large was moving just out of sight, swirling the water around me. I reached the roof of the habitat. The top of the drop is a flat deck cluttered with antennas, sensor arrays, and the scrubber intake. I scanned the area with my light. Empty. Just the silent, falling snow of organic debris. I shuffled toward the intake unit. I could see the blockage clearly now. It wasn't just a bone. It was a human femur, bleached white, wedged violently between the impeller blades. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the hypoxia. That bone had been stripped clean. There were gnaw marks on the marrow. I knelt down, the suit groaning. I reached out with my free hand and grabbed the bone. It was stuck fast. I yanked. It didn't budge. I braced my boot against the housing and pulled again. Snap. The bone broke and the debris dislodged. The impeller shuddered, then slowly began to spin. A low vibration hummed through the deck plates. The scrubbers were back online. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Step 1 complete. Now get the hell back inside. I turned to head back to the ladder, and there it was. It was floating directly in front of me, maybe 2 feet away. It had come up over the edge of the roof while I was distracted. Up close, it was hideous. The skin wasn't smooth. It was covered in tiny, transparent sensory hairs that waved in the current. The gill slits on its neck fluttered, pumping water. But it was the face that froze me. It was mimicking me, not physically. It still had that flat, noseless visage, but it was tilting its head exactly the way I did. It held its hands up, fingers spread, mirroring my posture. Then I heard it. My radio was silent. The comms were still cut, but sound travels through water, and it travels through the helmet shell. It was the sound of my regulator breathing. The creature's chest didn't move, but the sound was coming from its throat. It was recording the noise of my life support and playing it back to me. Then, underneath the mechanical breathing, a voice. Step 1, complete. It was my voice, my internal monologue. The thought I had just had in my head. My blood ran cold. I hadn't spoken aloud. I hadn't keyed the mic. How did it know? I realized then that it wasn't reading my mind. It was repeating something I had said on the last dive. Or maybe it was just guessing, pulling phrases from a library of stolen sounds. It drifted closer. It reached out a hand toward my faceplate. I reacted on instinct. I brought the welding torch up and squeezed the trigger. The arc didn't produce a flame, but it created a bubble of superheated plasma, glowing blindingly white in the darkness. The water around the tip boiled instantly, creating a cavitation bubble that collapsed with a deafening crack. The creature shrieked, a sound I felt in my bones, and thrashed backward. The light had blinded it, or the heat had burned its sensory hairs. The darkness rushed back in as the arc died, leaving spots dancing in my eyes. I didn't wait to see if it was hurt. I turned and ran for the ladder. Running in a suit means falling forward and hoping you catch yourself. I slammed into the railing, grabbing the ladder rungs. I basically slid down the side of the hull, ignoring the safety protocols, ignoring the decompression risks. I hit the porch grating with a heavy crash. I scrambled for the airlock wheel. My hand fumbled with the latch. I spun it. The door groaned open. Something grabbed my ankle. It wasn't a hand. It felt like a rope, a tail. I was yanked backward. My faceplate slammed into the deck grating. I felt a sharp crack, the sound of the outer polycarbonate shield fracturing. I kicked. I thrashed. I rolled onto my back. The creature had wrapped its tail around my leg. It was dragging me toward the rail, toward the drop-off into the trench. I couldn't reach it with the torch. I was tangled in my own umbilical. I grabbed the airlock door frame with my left hand. The metal dug into my glove. I pulled, fighting the drag of the creature. It was a tug of war, me versus the ocean. I screamed, a raw, primal sound in my helmet. I kicked out with my free leg, driving the heavy magnetic boot into the creature's midsection. I felt ribs snap, soft, cartilaginous ribs. The grip loosened. I scrambled backward, crab walking into the airlock. I pulled my legs in. A hand, pale, long-fingered, shot through the closing gap. It grabbed the edge of the door frame. It wasn't trying to pull me out anymore. It was trying to get in. I slammed the door. The heavy steel edge caught the fingers. There was no crunch, just a wet, squelching sound as the fingers were sheared off. I spun the wheel, locking the dogs. I collapsed against the inner wall, gasping for air, watching the severed fingers twitching on the floor of the airlock. They were still moving, curling and uncurling like dying worms. I hit the valve to drain the chamber. The water receded. The pressure dropped. I was safe. I was inside. I looked at the severed fingers again. As the water drained away, they began to dissolve. They turned into a gray, viscous sludge that washed down the drain. I leaned my head back against the cold steel, closing my eyes. I was alive. The scrubbers were fixed, but as the water gurgled away, I heard a sound from the other side of the inner door. Inside the habitat, Miller. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't crying. He was laughing, and he was talking to someone. "Come on in," he whispered. He left it unlocked. I froze. I had locked the inner door when I left. I was sure of it, but had I checked it? I scrambled to my feet, dread pooling in my stomach heavier than the ocean outside. I looked through the small viewport of the inner door into the habitat. Miller was out of his bunk. The zip ties were cut, sliced clean through, and he was standing by the emergency ballast release. His hand was on the lever. He looked at me through the glass. He smiled. "Going up," he mouthed, and he pulled the lever. The feeling of a ballast blow at depth is like being in a car crash that lasts for 3 hours. When Miller pulled that lever, 4 tons of lead weights dropped from the bottom of the habitat. We became a cork held underwater by a giant's hand, suddenly released. The habitat surged upward. The floor lurched, knocking me off my feet inside the airlock. I slammed against the wall, my head cracking against the steel. Gravity seemed to double, then vanish, then double again. I was trapped in the airlock. I scrambled for the inner door wheel. I had to get into the main chamber. The airlock is the most fragile part of the ship. If the pressure differential shifted too fast during the ascent, the outer door might blow, and I'd be sucked out into the void. I spun the wheel. It screamed, fighting the G-forces. I kicked the door open and fell into the main habitat. It was chaos. Tools, coffee cups, and equipment were flying through the air. The sudden acceleration had turned the drop into a tumble dryer, and there was Miller. He had been thrown against the comms console. He was crumpled on the deck, his limbs at unnatural angles. He wasn't smiling anymore. Blood was pouring from his nose and ears. I crawled over to him, grabbing the leg of the command chair to anchor myself. The habitat was vibrating so hard my teeth rattled. We were rocketing toward the surface at 500 feet per minute. I checked Miller's pulse. It was thready, fast. He opened his eyes. The whites were gone, completely filled with blood from the ruptured capillaries. He looked at me, and for the first time in days, he looked lucid. The madness was gone, replaced by a terrible, crushing clarity. He grabbed my wrist. His grip was weak, shaking. He whispered that he was sorry. He said the walls were getting thin. He said they were already inside, not in the room, but inside the metal. He died before we hit the thermocline. One moment he was staring at me. The next the light went out behind his eyes. I still don't know if he saved my life or just made sure nobody topside walked away. I was alone. Again. The ascent took 4 hours. It should have been a relief. We were going home, but all I could feel was the pressure. Even though the hull held the internal pressure steady, my body knew. My joints felt like they were filled with broken glass. The nitrogen in my blood was bubbling, itching under my skin. The phantom onset of the bends. I strapped myself into the pilot's chair and stared at the viewport. The blackness outside turned to a dark indigo, then a deep blue. Then, finally, the blinding, searing turquoise of the surface world. We breached. The habitat flew out of the water like a missile, hanging in the air for a weightless second, before crashing back down with a bone-shattering impact. We bobbed there, rolling violently in the Pacific swell. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just sat there, staring at the sunlight streaming through the quartz window. It was too bright. It burned my retinas. I wanted the red light back, I wanted the dark. I waited. The Ares support ship would have seen our beacon. They would be scrambling a recovery team. They would clamp a crane onto us, lift the habitat onto the deck, and mate us to the massive hyperbaric system on the ship. I would have to spend the next week in a decompression chamber, slowly bleeding the helium out of my system. I sat there for an hour, listening to the waves slap against the hull. It sounded wrong. It wasn't the rhythmic slap of water. It was irregular. I looked at the window. The waterline was bobbing up and down. Then I saw it, a scratch, a deep, gouged line in the quartz on the outside. It was fresh. I unbuckled and leaned forward. I pressed my face to the glass, shielding my eyes from the sun. The railing on the starboard side, the one the creature had used to pull itself up, was bent, twisted like a paperclip, and tangled in the wreckage of the antenna array. Something was moving. It wasn't a piece of seaweed. It was pale. It was drying out in the sun, turning a sickly gray, but it was still twitching. It was hiding in the shadow of the intake valve. The recovery boat arrived. I heard the thud of the divers landing on the roof. I heard them hammering on the hull, signaling that they were hooking up the crane. I tried to grab the wrench to bang back, to warn them, to tell them to burn it off, but my hands wouldn't work. The adrenaline had faded, and the exhaustion hit me like a sledgehammer. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. They hoisted the habitat out of the water. I felt the sway as we were lifted into the air. I looked out the window one last time. As we rose above the waterline, I saw the underside of the habitat. It was covered in them. Hundreds of deep, circular scour marks. They hadn't just been tapping. They had been latching on. They were hitchhikers. And as the crane swung us toward the deck of the Ares, toward the team of unsuspecting sailors and medics, I saw the creature hiding in the antenna turn its head. It looked at me through the glass. Its skin was blistering in the sun, its eyes clouding over, but it was still alive. It raised a hand and tapped on the glass. I'm out of the chamber now. It's been 3 months. I have a tremor in my left hand that the doctors say is permanent nerve damage from the ascent. They say Miller died of a cerebral hemorrhage caused by the pressure change. They say it was a tragic accident. They didn't find the creatures. When they opened the hatch on the deck of the Ares, the hull was clean. No scratches, no bent railing, no pale monsters. They told me I hallucinated it. They said isolation psychosis and oxygen toxicity made me see things. They prescribed me pills and sent me home. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is just my brain rotting from bad gas mixes and too many hours in the dark. But I know what I saw, and I know what I hear. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the traffic dies down, I hear it. Not in the ocean, in the pipes. I hear it in the plumbing behind the bathroom wall. I hear it in the hiss of the radiator. I don't take baths anymore, and I never, ever turn off the lights, because the ocean is deep, but pipes connect to everything, and I think I brought them home.